The air in the grand, silent house was thick with a silence that had texture, a heavy, smothering blanket of recent trauma and unspoken dread. It was in this oppressive quiet that Phyllis Summers found herself adrift, a ship with a shattered hull taking on water faster than any frantic hand could bail. The memory of what she had done, the single violent, irrevocable action that had extinguished Kane's life, was not a linear narrative in her mind but a chaotic storm of sensory fragments. The sharp crack of the fire poker connecting, not with the dull thud she might have expected from television, but with a sickening wet finality that seemed to echo in the very marrow of her bones. The way his eyes, wide with a surprise that was too immediate to even be fear, had lost their focus, turning from seeing her to seeing nothing at all. The weight of his body as he collapsed, a marionette with its strings severed. These were the ghosts that danced behind her own eyes every time she blinked, a private horror show playing on an endless, agonizing loop. She was, in her own estimation, a monster. There was no court in the world that could convict her more harshly than she was already convicting herself, the gavel of her own conscience pounding a relentless verdict of guilt. She was raw, exposed, a live wire of panic and remorse, and it was into this state of profound vulnerability that Matt Miller stepped, not as a judge but as a savior, his arrival feeling less like a coincidence and more like a divine intervention in her moment of absolute darkest need. He found her curled into a tight ball on a plush sofa, her body trembling with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She didn't need to speak. The whole story was written in the frantic, shattered look in her eyes, in the way her hands couldn't seem to stop shaking. And Matt, instead of recoiling in the horror that she felt she deserved, simply moved towards her, his presence a calm, steady anchor in her raging sea of terror. He didn't shout, he didn't accuse, he didn't even ask for details, not at first. He simply gathered her into his arms, his embrace a fortress against the world she was certain was about to come crashing down upon her. He held her while she sobbed, great, heaving sobs that felt like they were tearing her apart from the inside out, and he whispered the first, most crucial seeds of his narrative into her ear. "It was an accident, Phyllis," he murmured, his voice a low, hypnotic drone against the cacophony in her head. "You were scared. You were defending yourself. He pushed you, didn't he? He backed you into a corner. Anyone would have reacted the same way." In her fractured state, his words were not just comfort. They were a lifeline, the first alternative to the crushing monolithic truth of her own monstrousness. He was offering her a new lens through which to view the unspeakable, and her mind, desperate for any escape from the prison of its own guilt, clung to it with the desperation of a drowning woman. This was the foundational stage, the careful priming of the canvas. Matt understood, with an instinctual genius for manipulation, that he could not simply command her to believe a new reality. He had to first dismantle the old one. He began to meticulously reframe the entire event, not as a cold-blooded killing, but as a tragic, unavoidable consequence of a situation Kane himself had created. He would sit with her for hours, in the dim lamplight of the living room, and talk in calm, reasoned tones. "Think about it, Phyllis," he would say, his eyes holding hers, refusing to let her look away from his constructed truth. "Think about the way he was acting. The aggression. The threats. He wasn't the man you thought you knew. He was a danger to you. You didn't go looking for a fight. The fight came to you. You had no choice." He would repeat these phrases, these core tenets of his new gospel, with slight variations over and over and over. The word murder was banished from their vocabulary, replaced with the accident, the tragedy, that terrible night. He never allowed her to linger on the image of Kane as a victim. He was always the aggressor, the instigator, the architect of his own demise. Phyllis, her own memory now clouded by trauma and fear, found the edges of the event beginning to blur. Was Kane's voice really raised? Had he taken a step toward her that was more menacing than she'd initially recalled? Matt's confident, assured version of events began to feel more real, more solid, than her own chaotic and painful memories. Her reality was becoming a fragile thing, and he was the one holding the glue. Isolation was his next, most powerful tool. He became the sole gatekeeper of her world. He would answer her phone, deftly turning away calls from her daughter, Summer, or anyone else who might offer a competing perspective or a voice of concern. "They wouldn't understand, Phyllis," he would explain, his face a mask of sympathetic concern. "They'll just judge you. They'll see you as a criminal. They'll want to call the police, and then where will you be? In a cage for defending yourself? I'm the only one who knows the whole story. The only one who knows it wasn't your fault. He painted the outside world as a hostile, judgmental place, full of people who would never grasp the nuance of her situation. Her friends and family were recast, not as a support system, but as a potential jury, a lynch mob waiting for a confession. In this carefully constructed echo chamber, his voice became the only one that mattered. It was the voice of reason, of protection, of absolute loyalty. Her dependence on him grew with every passing hour. He was her provider of food, of solace, of the very narrative that was keeping her from completely shattering. To question him would be to question the very foundation that was keeping her upright, and she was far too broken, far too terrified to risk such a collapse. The process was a gradual erosion of self, a quiet, insidious takeover of her will. Matt's techniques were a textbook, if unconscious, application of coercive control. He would offer her small, comforting rewards for accepting his narrative. A warm embrace, a soothing word, the promise of safety and a future beyond this nightmare. Conversely, any flicker of her old, independent self, any moment where she voiced a stubborn shard of her original memory and guilt, was met with a subtle but potent withdrawal. He wouldn't get angry. He would become distant, wounded, his expression clouded with disappointment. "I'm trying to help you, Phyllis," he would say, his voice heavy with a sorrow that felt like her own failure. "I'm the only one on your side. If you can't even see that, then maybe I can't protect you after all." The threat of losing his protection, of being cast back out into the terrifying, judgmental world he had described, was far more effective than any shouted argument. She learned, quickly and subconsciously, that agreement with Matt brought peace and the illusion of safety, while dissent brought a chilling isolation that was, in her current state, a fate worse than the guilt itself. Her thoughts were no longer entirely her own. They were a tangled amalgamation of her terror and his calm, persuasive logic. Weeks bled into one another, a strange, timeless purgatory within the walls of the house. The frantic, raw edge of Phyllis's initial panic had been sanded down, replaced by a dull, almost placid acceptance. She still had moments in the dead of night where the image of Kane's lifeless eyes would flash before her, but now Matt's voice was there to immediately counter it, a well-practiced mantra that rose to the surface of her mind without her even summoning it. He was a threat. You were defending yourself. It was a tragic accident. She had begun to say these words herself, at first parroting them back to him in a desperate attempt to believe them, and then slowly starting to voice them as her own genuine conclusions. One afternoon, as they were clearing away the remnants of a silent lunch, she looked at him, her eyes clearer than they had been in a long time, but with a clarity that was not her own. "I just keep thinking," she said, her voice steady, unnervingly calm. "If he hadn't been so aggressive, if he hadn't come at me like that, none of this would have happened. He really left me with no other choice, didn't he?" It was the ultimate victory for Matt. The narrative had completed its journey from external suggestion to internalized belief. She had absorbed his truth so completely that it now emanated from her as her own. The final, crucial step in the brainwashing process was complete. She was not just repeating a story to please her captor. She was living it as her reality. The ultimate test, the final seal on this psychological prison, came with the external world's inevitable intrusion. A detective, following a routine missing persons inquiry into Kane, came to the door. Phyllis felt the old familiar terror surge through her, a cold spike of adrenaline that threatened to undo all of Matt's careful work. But as she stood there, her hand trembling in his, Matt squeezed it tightly, a silent signal. He did the talking, his demeanor the picture of concerned cooperation. He spoke of Kane's recent volatile behavior, of how he and Phyllis had been worried about him, of how he seemed to have just vanished. And when the detective's eyes turned to Phyllis, asking if she had anything to add, she took a shallow breath. The words that came out were not the scream of confession that her soul had once held, but the calm, rehearsed lines of the new identity Matt had built for her. "He was very troubled lately," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but firm in its delivery. "We had an argument. He was angry. I was afraid. And then he just left." She met the detective's gaze, and in her eyes, he did not see a guilty woman, but a shaken, relieved one. There was no flicker of the truth because for Phyllis in that moment this was the truth. The brainwashing was not merely a performance for an audience. It was a fundamental rewriting of her psyche. She had crossed the Rubicon, and there was no easy path back. The woman who had killed Cain was gone, buried under the layers of Matt's meticulously constructed fiction, and in her place stood a woman who genuinely believed she was a victim of circumstance, her protector standing faithfully by her side, the architect of her new, terrifyingly fragile reality. The line between the lie and her truth had not just been blurred, it had been utterly erased, leaving a ghost in its place, a phantom who wore Phyllis's face and spoke with her voice, but whose conscience now belonged entirely to Matt. Phyllis had always believed herself to be someone who could see through manipulation, someone who recognized trouble the moment it crept into her life, but what she didn't realize was that Matt had been studying her for weeks, patiently watching and understanding the rhythm of her weaknesses. He knew how guilt weighed on her like an anchor, how her fear of being exposed made her shaky and reactive, and how the desperate need to stay in control made her vulnerable in ways she refused to acknowledge. Matt didn't appear as a threat. He came as someone who offered clarity, someone who promised to help her manage the emotional fallout of what she had done, even though he was the last person she should have trusted. At first, his words sounded like comfort, but little by little, his voice began to thread itself through her thoughts, reshaping what she believed, retelling her memories, and convincing her that her actions had been necessary. Phyllis had no idea that the descent into Matt's psychological labyrinth had already begun. She replayed that night over and over again, the night Cain died. Her mistake. Her panic. The split-second decision that spiraled into a nightmare she couldn't wake from. He hadn't meant to provoke her, not really. Cain had been angry, yes. Emotional, definitely. But she misjudged his intentions, convinced herself he was about to expose something, or hurt her, or ruin her chances of repairing her life. She had built an entire narrative in those frantic seconds, one that had justified acting first before he could. The truth, the real truth, was tangled in adrenaline and fear, and every time she tried to unravel it, her mind twisted into knots of denial and desperation. She didn't want to accept that she had misread him. She didn't want to face the fact that his death hadn't been some inevitable outcome, but rather a tragic consequence of her impulsiveness. And that was exactly the wound Matt kept pressing. He started subtly, planting questions rather than answers. "Are you sure Cain wasn't reaching for something?" He'd ask, voice soft, eyes sympathetic. "You know his temper. You know how unpredictable he became when he felt backed into a corner." At first she resisted, shaking her head, trying to keep the flickering memories steady. But Matt remained calm, endlessly patient, circling back with gentle insistence. "It doesn't make sense that you acted without reason," he'd say, making her feel as though admitting she was wrong would mean admitting she was reckless, dangerous, unworthy of redemption. And Phyllis craved redemption more than anything. He knew that. He fed it. He used it. The more Matt repeated these notions, the more her memories adapted to fit the version he painted. She stopped fighting the idea that Cain had posed a threat. She began to accept, no, believe that she had acted in self-defense. In Matt's presence she started to let go of the truth she had been avoiding, the truth that tormented her at night. He replaced that truth with a story that made her feel less guilty, less monstrous. It was easier to believe Matt than to confront the consequences of her actions. The human mind protects itself in ways both miraculous and terrifying, and Matt understood that better than anyone. He didn't need to force her to adopt his version of events. All he had to do was carefully nudge her toward the interpretation she already wished were real. Phyllis didn't realize how dependent she had become on him, until she began seeking him out to reassure her memories. She'd sit across from him, hands trembling, voice shaky, asking, "Do you really think Cain would have gone after me? Do you think I had no choice?" And Matt, with the practiced steadiness of a seasoned manipulator, would look at her with deep sincerity and reply, "You survived, Phyllis. That alone proves you did what you had to." Those words, spoken with such calm conviction, wrapped around her guilt like a soothing blanket. She clung to them even though they were rapidly unraveling whatever remained of her moral compass. As days passed, Matt tightened his grip on her psyche. He controlled when she remembered and when she forgot. He controlled how she interpreted guilt. He controlled whether she saw herself as a victim or a villain. Slowly, Phyllis stopped thinking independently. She adopted Matt's voice as her internal monologue, replaying his reassurances every time fear clawed at her chest. Whenever she questioned herself, she heard him telling her she had no other choice. Whenever she panicked at the thought of someone uncovering the truth, she remembered his insistence that the truth had already been shaped, that it was her survival narrative, not the objective reality of the night Kane died. She didn't notice that she had stopped confiding in anyone else. She didn't see the subtle isolation he engineered around her, creating a world where only he understood her and everyone else became a potential threat. Matt saw the influence he held over her and began to test how far it stretched. He inserted opinions about people in her life, planting seeds of distrust, suggesting that certain individuals were trying to trap her or turn her in. He suggested that anyone questioning her version of events was doing so because they wanted her to suffer. He pushed her away from allies and toward paranoia, reinforcing the idea that only he had her back. This was the final stage of his brainwashing, the creation of dependency that ensured she would follow whatever path he laid out for her next. And Phyllis, exhausted, guilty, confused, and increasingly unstable, followed him without hesitation. The transformation wasn't abrupt. It was gradual, so gradual that Phyllis believed she was healing, when in reality she was surrendering pieces of herself to Matt's control. Her instincts dulled. Her emotional compass broke. Her ability to question him eroded. She started parroting his language, using his justifications, repeating his fabricated scenarios as her own lived truth. If someone asked her about Kane, she recited the narrative Matt had crafted, and over time she came to believe it fully. She no longer remembered the hesitation she felt. She no longer remembered the regret that had suffocated her. Matt had replaced those feelings with cold determination, convincing her that her survival depended on maintaining the story they had discovered together. Meanwhile, those around her started to notice changes. Her behavior became erratic, too calm sometimes, too reactive at others. She seemed emotionally detached from reality, yet fiercely protective of the narrative Matt fed her. When someone mentioned Kane's name, she stiffened, repeating her story word for word, as if reading from a script. People whispered behind her back, sensing something off but not realizing the depth of Matt's influence. She was turning into someone incapable of acknowledging her actions, someone blind to the truth, someone groomed to defend a version of events designed to shield her from accountability. The more she clung to Matt, the more dangerous she became. She interpreted concern as hostility, suspicion as betrayal, and attempts to help her as efforts to expose her. Her paranoia grew like a wildfire, fed by the constant whispers Matt placed in her ear. He encouraged her to stay ahead of people. He planted thoughts about covering her tracks further, discouraging any moment of reflection that might shatter the illusion he had built. He wanted her malleable, attached, reactive, and willing to take risks for the sake of survival. And Phyllis, drowned in the psychological fog he engineered, complied. One night, while alone, Phyllis stared at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the person looking back at her. She felt hollow, like her emotions had been drained and replaced with Matt's logic. Her memories of Kane became blurry, shifting like sand every time she tried to hold on to them. She could no longer distinguish real recollections from the ones Matt fed her. For a brief second she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake, if she had killed Kane in fear, not defense. But as soon as that thought surfaced, she heard Matt's voice echoing in her mind, reminding her she had no choice. She repeated his words aloud until her doubts disappeared. The guilt she had once felt no longer manifested as remorse but as fear of being discovered. Matt had successfully redirected her emotional compass. She wasn't trying to make peace with her actions anymore. She was trying to survive being caught. And that shift, subtle yet profound, made her capable of even more dangerous decisions. Matt saw this transformation as proof of his success. She was fully under his control, emotionally rewired, mentally dependent, morally compromised. Phyllis moved through her days with a cold determination she had never possessed before. She covered loose ends, destroyed evidence she once would have hesitated to touch, and confronted anyone who asked too many questions. Her emotional volatility made her unpredictable. She oscillated between calm detachment and sudden bursts of anger when she felt threatened. Matt coached her through every step, reminding her to stay aligned with the story, to dismiss doubts, to protect herself at all costs. She obeyed him with a loyalty so absolute it alarmed even Matt at times. As the truth about Kane's death began to surface through other channels, clues, witnesses, inconsistencies, Phyllis grew more desperate. She confronted people who weren't actually accusing her. She cut ties with those who loved her, believing they were plotting to expose her. Matt encouraged each confrontation, framing it as taking control of the narrative. She didn't realize that the more she tried to hide, the more suspicious she became. And while Matt assured her he had everything under control, Phyllis didn't see how he had positioned her to take the fall alone if the truth came out. In the end, the deepest tragedy wasn't Kane's death. It was the total unraveling of Phyllis's sense of reality. She believed she had been justified. She believed she had survived a threat. She believed Matt had saved her mind when in reality he had stolen it. She had made a catastrophic mistake in killing Kane, but the even greater mistake was letting Matt shape her grief, her guilt, and ultimately her identity. She was no longer the Phyllis who panicked that night. She was a version of herself built entirely from Matt's manipulations, a version that couldn't see the difference between truth and survival. And as more people grew suspicious, as the walls began to close in around her, Matt quietly stepped back, knowing he had already done enough damage. Phyllis would face the consequences, but she would face them believing she had been right all along. And that, Matt believed, was the perfect ending to his control. A woman who had destroyed herself without ever realizing how deeply he had buried the truth inside her mind.